The sun hung like a molten coin in the Arizona sky, scorching the endless sprawl of sagebrush, cactus, and jagged rock, with a heat that could blister a man's soul. Dust swirled in lazy spirals carried by a mournful wind that whispered secrets across the cracked, sun-baked earth, its voice a low hum that seemed to carry the weight of ancient stories. A lone hawk circled high above its shadow, slicing the ground like a knife, hunting for anything foolish enough to stir in the midday blaze, its cry sharp and fleeting in the vast silence. In a sagging ranch house, 16-year-old Lucy Starr stood at a chipped wooden sink, scrubbing a tin plate in a bucket of soapy water, gone gray with grit, the suds clinging to her calloused fingers like stubborn ghosts. Her sun-bleached hair hung in a loose braid, strands sticking to her sweat-damp neck, and her eyes, sharp as a coyote's, carried a weight no kid should bear. Eyes that had seen too much, known too much since her mother's death 3 years ago, left her alone with a man who turned her days into a gauntlet of fear. The kitchen was a cramped, weathered box, its walls stained with years of smoke and neglect, the air heavy with the scent of old grease dust and despair. A single window let in slants of harsh light, illuminating specks of dust that floated like ghosts in the stale air, dancing in the beams like memories of better days. Lucy's hands moved quick but careful, calloused from endless chores, mending fences under the brutal sun, hauling water from a distant well, feeding the few scrawny chickens that scratched out a living in the hardscrabble yard. She was an orphan now, her mother's laughter, just a faint echo buried under the weight of Caleb Drake's cruelty, a man who'd come into their lives like a storm and stayed to break everything in his path. Lucy had learned to read his moods like a tracker, reads the land knowing when to duck, when to hide, when to pray for the night to pass quietly. The door slammed open, rattling the frame, shaking the walls like a warning shot. Caleb stumbled in, reeking of cheap liquor and bad decisions, his presence filling the room like a dark cloud. His scarred, sunburned face was a map of hard living, etched with lines of anger and failure, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Lucy like a rattler spotting prey. His boots thudded heavy on the warped floorboards, each step a promise of trouble, the sound echoing in Lucy's chest like a drumbeat of dread. He tossed his battered hat onto the table, sending a cloud of dust swirling into the light, the air thick with the sour stink of whiskey, sweat, and rage. "You still here, girl?" He slurred his voice, thick with venom, each word dripping like poison from a wound. "Thought you'd learned to make yourself scarce by now." Lucy froze, her hands still in the water, her heart kicking like a spooked horse, its rhythm loud in her ears. She didn't look up, but her shoulders tensed, braced for the trouble she knew was coming. Her body coiled like a spring. "Just finishing the dishes, Caleb," she said, her voice quiet but steady, like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap under the strain. "Ain't looking for trouble." Caleb snorted, staggering closer, his shadow falling over her like a storm cloud, blocking the light from the window, casting the room into a sudden gloom. His hand clenched into a fist, knuckles white as bone, the air around him heavy with menace, his breath a sour wave that made her stomach churn. "Trouble you are trouble, Lucy Starr," he growled, his words slurring together, thick with drink and bitterness. "Ever since your ma up and died, you've been a curse on this house. Cost me a fortune in town today, poker table cleaned me out. Lost every damn cent I had, every coin I scraped together. And whose fault is that?" Lucy's eyes flicked to the door, measuring the distance, 6 steps, maybe 7, to the porch, to freedom, however fleeting. She'd seen him like this before when the saloon took his money, and he needed someone to bleed for it, when the weight of his failures turned into fists and fury. The poker games in town had a way of eating through what little they had, leaving them scraping by on nothing but dust and dreams the ranch barely holding together under the strain of his losses. When Caleb lost, he always came home looking for a fight, and Lucy was always the one in his sights, the one who paid for his sins. "Ain't my fault you can't hold your cards." "Caleb," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, her voice soft but carrying a spark of defiance, like a match struck in a dry barn, dangerous and reckless. Caleb's face twisted, his eyes narrowing to slits, a storm brewing behind them, dark and ugly, ready to break. He lunged, grabbing her wrist with a grip like a bear trap, his fingers digging into her skin, hard enough to leave marks that would linger for days, purple and angry. Lucy gasped, the plate slipping from her hands and clattering into the bucket water, sloshing onto the floor, soaking the hem of her faded cotton dress, the cold shock grounding her in the moment. You sassing me, girl? He snarled, his breath hitting her face like a wave of poison, sour and hot, his eyes wild with a rage that had no reason, only hunger. I'll teach you respect, same way I taught your ma when she stepped out of line. Lucy twisted free, her wrists burning where his fingers had clamped down the pain, sharp but familiar, a reminder of the life she'd endured. She bolted for the door, heart pounding like a war drum, her boots slipping on the slick floorboards as she ran, her breath catching in her throat. She burst through onto the porch, the warped boards creaking under her weight, the sounds sharp in the still air. She sprinted into the open desert, her dress flapping like a tattered flag of surrender, the fabric catching on her legs as she moved. Behind her, Caleb's roar shook the walls, a sound that promised pain, a sound she'd heard too many times. You can't run forever, Lucy, he bellowed, his voice, chasing her into the heat, raw and hateful. I'll find you, and you'll pay for ruining me. She didn't look back, didn't dare, her eyes fixed on the horizon, on the endless stretch of rock and scrub that offered no mercy. The desert was a cruel maze dotted with sagebrush, cacti, and boulders that could hide a rattler or break an ankle, their shadows long and treacherous in the midday sun. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning her dress damp with sweat, every step kicking up small clouds of dust that marked her trail for anyone following a trail she couldn't hide. She heard the creak of saddle leather and the sharp snort of a horse Caleb was coming, mounted on his bay gelding, iron, a beast as mean as its rider, with a temper that matched Caleb's own, its hooves pounding the earth like a death knell. Lucy ran, her breath ragged, her boots pounding the earth, sending pebbles skittering across the hardpan, each step a defiance against the fear that clawed at her. She knew this desert better than most, had explored its secrets as a child before Caleb came into their lives, when her mother's smile still lit up the world, when the ranch was a home, not a prison. She knew the hidden springs tucked in shaded canyons, the narrow paths where the land could hide you or betray you, the places where the desert whispered its secrets to those who listen. But she also knew Caleb meaner than a cornered rattler, his rage fueled by whiskey and failure, his heart a black pit that swallowed everything good. He wouldn't stop till he had her, and out here in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, there was nowhere to hide, no one to hear her cries. The sound of Iron's hooves grew louder, a steady, relentless drumbeat closing the gap, each thud a promise of the punishment to come. Come, a rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. Lucy veered toward a cluster of boulders, their shadows offering a fleeting hope of cover their jagged edges, a maze that might slow him down. She wove through them, her breath burning in her chest, her legs aching, but refusing to give out, her train racing with fragments of memory, her mother's voice soft and warm, telling her to be strong, to never let the world break her. She had to keep moving, had to find a way to lose him in the maze of stone, to outrun the man who'd turned her life into a nightmare. Then a new sound cut through the air. Not the steady rhythm of Iron's hooves, but something bigger, deeper, like thunder rolling up from the earth itself, shaking the ground beneath her feet, a tremor that vibrated through her bones. Lucy slowed her chest, heaving her lungs, screaming for air, her body trembling from exertion. She risked a glance back, squinting against the glare of the sun, her eyes watering in the harsh light. Over a distant ridge, a cloud of dust rose swirling like a storm, and from it emerged a sight that stopped her cold, a herd of wild horses, at least 20 strong, charging straight toward them, their hooves a deafening roar that drowned out all else. Their manes streamed like war banners in the desert wind, their coats gleaming with sweat and dust, muscles rippling under scarred hides that told tales of survival in a land that forgave no weakness. At their head was a massive black stallion's shadow, his coat black as midnight, scarred from battles won against predators and rivals, his chest bearing marks of a life spent defying the odds. His eyes, dark and fierce, locked onto Caleb's approaching horse, his ear pinned back in a warning. No man with sense would ignore a signal of raw, untamed power. But Caleb, drunk and blind with anger, didn't notice his focus locked on Lucy, his prey, his rage, a fire that consumed all reason. Lord have mercy, Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart, her breath catching in her throat. The herd wasn't running away. They were running toward them, a tide of muscle and fury, the ground trembling under their hooves, the air thick with the scent of earth and wildness. Lucy dove behind a boulder, her body pressed against the rough, sun-warmed stone, her breath shallow and fast, her hands gripping the rock to steady herself. She peeked out, watching as Shadow let out a piercing whinny, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls like a call to war, sharp and primal, a challenge that no creature could ignore. The herd spread out, forming a wide circle around Caleb and Lucy, their movements precise, predatory like wolves closing in on a kill, their eyes glinting with a cold intelligence that made her skin crawl. Caleb finally saw them, yanking Iron's reins to slow his charge, his movements jerky, unsteady, his face paling as the whiskey haze parted just enough for fear to creep in. "What in blazes?" he shouted, his voice cracking with something new, uncertainty, maybe even dread, a realization that he'd stumbled into something bigger than his rage. Aaron danced nervously beneath him, the gelding's ears twitching, sensing the danger his rider was too foolish to fully grasp, its hooves pawing the ground in agitation. The herd tightened the circle, their eyes glinting with that same cold intelligence, their hooves kicking up dust that hung in the air like a shroud obscuring the world in a haze of grit and menace. Lucy pressed herself harder against the boulder, her heart hammering so loud she could feel it in her throat, her pulse a frantic rhythm that drowned out the world. She'd heard stories of wild horses protecting their territory, trampling anything that dared cross their path, man or beast, their fury a force of nature that bowed to no one. Shadow stepped closer to Caleb, foam flecking his muzzle, his muscles bunching beneath his scarred hide, his eyes holding a primal territorial fire that spoke of countless battles won in this unforgiving land. Caleb raised a hand, maybe to threaten, maybe to ward off the stallion, a reckless move either way, born of desperation or stupidity. It was a mistake, and he paid for it. Shadow reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves slashing through the air like weapons forged from bone and fury, cutting through the dust with deadly precision. Caleb screamed a raw, guttural sound as one hoof caught his shoulder, the force knocking him clean off Iron, sending him tumbling to the ground. He hit the earth hard, dust exploding around him like a small bomb, the air filled with the sharp scent of earth and blood, the impact shaking the ground beneath Lucy's feet. Iron, spooked beyond reason, bolted into the desert rains, flapping hooves pounding in a blind panic, leaving his rider to the mercy of the herd. Lucy watched, frozen, her breath catching in her chest, her hands gripping the boulder so tight her knuckles whitened, her nails digging into the stone. Shadow circled back, snorting and pawing the ground, his eyes never leaving Caleb, his body taut with purpose. The other horses closed in their movements, like wolves stalking a wounded deer, their hooves kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the air, their whinnies sharp and menacing. Caleb scrambled to his feet, clutching his injured shoulder, blood seeping through his torn shirt, staining the fabric a dark, ugly red. His face was a mask of pain, but his eyes found Lucy's hiding spot, and even now, beaten and bleeding, his rage burned hotter than the desert sun. "This is your doing, you little witch," he snarled, his voice carrying across the circle of horse, raw and hateful, each word a blade aimed at her heart. "You brought this on me." Lucy's stomach twisted, a cold knot of fear and realization tightening in her gut. She thought the horses were her salvation, a force of nature come to punish the man who'd tormented her for years, who'd turned her life into a prison of fear. But they weren't taking sides, they were protecting their land from all intruders, and that included her. Shadow's head swung toward her, his ears flicking forward as he caught her scent on the desert wind, his eyes locking onto her hiding spot with that same cold intelligence. The herd shifted some, turning their attention to her boulder, their hooves clicking against the stone, their snorts a warning that she was no safer than Caleb. "Oh no, you don't," she muttered, her voice trembling, but resolute, her mind racing for a way out. She made a choice that could end her life. She broke from cover, sprinting toward a narrow canyon she'd found years ago, a crack in the rocks too tight for horses to follow, a secret she'd discovered as a child when the world was kinder. It was her only shot, 50 yards away, across open ground, every step a gamble against the desert's dangers. Rattlesnakes, loose rocks, the relentless sun that sapped her strength. Shadow wheeled around with lightning speed, his hooves shaking the earth as he charged after her, his massive form a black blur against the dust, his breath hot and heavy. Behind, Caleb's screams turned from rage to terror as two mares drove him away from any shelter, their hooves striking like hammers, their whinnies sharp and merciless, a chorus of wild justice. Lucy's lungs burned as she ran the canyon opening 30 yards away, then 20, then 10. Each step a desperate plea for survival. Shadow was so close she could feel his breath on her neck, the percussion of his hooves rattling her bones, the ground trembling beneath her. She dove through the gap, her shoulders scraping against the rough walls, the stone tearing at her dress, drawing thin lines of blood that stung in the dry air. Shadow skidded to a stop, his massive head jamming into the opening, but he couldn't fit more than his muzzle through his frustrated snort echoing in the tight space, a sound of raw power checked by the unyielding rock. Lucy stumbled into a small cave, her hands shaking so violently she could barely wipe the sweat from her eyes, her vision blurred with exhaustion and fear. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the desert's relentless heat, the walls smooth and cold under her trembling fingers, the darkness a fleeting comfort. Outside, the herd's hooves clicked against stone circling, searching for another way in their snorts and whinnies, a constant reminder of the danger just beyond the rock. She pressed herself against the back wall, her heart pounding and her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her body trembling from the effort of her escape. The cave was a sanctuary, but it was also a trap. It was safe from the horses, but not from what might follow, not from the man who'd made her life a nightmare. Then a new sound froze her blood boots, scraping rock too close, too deliberate, the sound of a predator closing in. Caleb's voice cut through the darkness, a harsh whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves surrounding her, trapping her. You thought you could hide, girl, ain't no hiding from me. He'd found another entrance, one she'd forgotten. In her panic, a narrow passage she'd explored as a child but hadn't thought of in years, a betrayal of her own memory. His shadow filled the cave, mouth blocking out the faint light that filtered through the cracks, his bulk making the small space feel suffocating like a coffin closing around her. Even battered by the horses, he looked enormous, his bloodied face twisted with a hatred that had survived every blow, every humiliation, his eyes gleaming with a madness that chilled her to the bone. This ends now, Lucy. He rasped, his voice low and venomous, echoing in the confined space, each word a promise of violence. You and me, we're settling accounts. Lucy backed deeper into the cave, her hands groping blindly for anything. A rock, a stick, anything to defend herself. But the walls were smooth, the floor bare, offering no mercy, no hope. The cave that had seemed like salvation was now a tomb, a dead end with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And Caleb stepped forward, his breathing heavy and ragged, his eyes gleaming with a desperation more dangerous than his anger. A man pushed to the edge and ready to drag her down with him. All your fault, he said, his voice bouncing off the stone, seeming to come from everywhere, at once a chorus of blame and rage. The poker losses, the bad luck, every damn thing gone wrong since your ma brought you into my life. You're a curse, girl, and I'm going to end it. Lucy's back hit the far wall, nowhere left to go, the cold stone pressing against her spine like a final judgment. Her heart pounded, but she lifted her chin, staring him down, her eyes burning with defiance despite the fear clawing at her insides of a fire that refused to be snuffed out. You touch me, Caleb, and I'll haunt you till the devil takes you, she said, or her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, her words a challenge, a spark in the darkness. Caleb laughed, a sound like gravel underfoot, harsh and cruel, his hand rising to strike his shadow, looming larger, filling the cave with darkness, with the promise of pain. Outside, Shadow stood at the canyon entrance, his ears twitching, his head turned toward the horizon where a faint cloud of dust rose in the distance, a sign of movement in the endless desert. He let out a sharp whinny, a call that cut through the desert silence like a blade and bolted the herd thundering after him like a storm rolling across the land, their hooves a drumbeat of purpose. On a dusty trail nearby, Jack Coulter, a weathered cowboy in his 30s, rode his gray Mustang. Smoke, his duster coat flapping in the wind, his eyes sharp under the brim of his Stetson, scanning the desert for signs of trouble, for signs of life. Jack was a wanderer, a man who'd seen too much to believe in heroes, his face carved by sun and sorrow, his hands steady from years of surviving the frontier fights in dusty saloons, nights under starlit skies, days spent outrunning men and beasts alike. He lived by a code simple but unbreakable: help those who couldn't help themselves, a promise he'd made to himself after too many losses he couldn't undo. Shadow burst over a rise, skidding to a stop in front of Jack, rearing up, hooves slashing the air. His eyes wild but not threatening, his body tense with purpose, as if he'd been sent on a mission by some higher power. Jack pulled Smoke to a halt, his hands steady on the reins, his gaze meeting the Stallion's, a silent conversation passing between man and beast. Easy, big fella, he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced down worse than a wild horse, who'd stared into the eyes of death and walked away. What's got you so riled? Shadow tossed his head toward the canyon, his ears flicking forward, his body trembling with urgency, his scarred coat gleaming in the sunlight. Jack squinted, catching the faint sound of a scream. Lucy's voice carried on the wind like a plea for salvation, a cry that cut through the desert's silence and stirred something deep in his chest. His jaw tightened, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip, and he spurred Smoke forward. Shadow leading the way, his massive strides eating up the ground, hooves kicking up dust that shimmered in the sunlight like a beacon. In the cave, Caleb's fingers grazed Lucy's throat, his breath hot and sour, his eyes gleaming with a hatred so pure it seemed to burn the air, a fire fed by years of failure and resentment. You're done, girl, he growled, his hand rising higher, poised to strike, to end her defiance once and for all. Lucy didn't flinch. She was done running, done letting fear rule her, done being the victim of a man who'd broken everything she loved. She screamed a raw, desperate sound that exploded through the canyon, echoing off the stone walls and out into the desert like a war cry, a call for help, for justice, for anything that could save her from the darkness closing in. The effect was immediate. Caleb froze, his hand trembling, his eyes widening as a new sound reached them, hooves steady and fast, a single rider approaching the rhythm distinct from the wild herd's thunder. Jack Coulter slid through the canyon gap, his Colt drawn, its barrel glinting in the dim light that filtered through the rocks, a cold promise in his steady hand. His boots were silent on the stone, his movements fluid, practiced, like a man who'd walked into danger more times than he could count, who'd learned to move like a shadow in places where death waited. Step away from the girl. Mister, he said, his voice cold and steady as steel, cutting through the darkness like a blade, each word measured, deliberate, leaving no room for doubt. Caleb spun, his face twisting with fury, his bloodied shoulder making him clumsy, but no less dangerous, his rage a fire that refused to die. He lunged at Jack, fists swinging, a bellow of rage tearing from his throat, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. But Jack was faster, his reflexes honed by years on the trail, by nights spent outrunning trouble, and days spent facing it head-on. He sidestepped, slamming the butt of his Colt into Caleb's temple with a sickening crack, the sound sharp in the confined space. The big man staggered, crashing into the cave wall, his knees buckling under him like a felled tree, his body slumping against the stone. Jack grabbed his collar, dragging him toward the entrance, his movements swift and precise, his strength belying his lean frame, his eyes never leaving Caleb's face. You all right, kid? He asked Lucy, his voice softening but still carrying that edge of readiness, his eyes scanning her for injuries, taking in the bruises on her wrist, the fear in her eyes, the defiance that still burned there. Lucy nodded, her voice caught in her throat, her hands still shaking from the terror of the moment, her body trembling but unbroken. Jack shoved Caleb outside where Shadow waited, snorting and pawing the ground, his eyes blazing with territorial fire, his scarred coat a testament to his strength. The herd circled in the fading light, their hooves kicking up dust, their whinnies sharp and menacing, a chorus of wild justice that filled the air. Caleb scrambled to his feet, clutching his bloodied shoulder, his eyes darting from Jack to the horses, fear finally overtaking his rage, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the herd's relentless gaze. Shadow reared again, his hooves flashing like blades, a warning that needed no words, a promise of what awaited if Caleb didn't run. Jack stepped between them, his gun trained on Caleb, steady as a rock, his posture calm but unyielding. Two choices. Friend, he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word measured, cutting through the tension like a knife. Run and pray these horses don't catch you, or stay and deal with me. Caleb's gaze flicked to Lucy, who stood at the cave entrance, her chin high, her eyes burning with defiance, despite the fear that still lingered, a fire that refused to be snuffed out. This ain't over, girl, he spat, his voice, ragged, broken, a final attempt to cling to his hatred. Shadow's whinny cut him off, a piercing sound that sent a shiver down Lucy's spine, a call that spoke of wild things and untamed justice. The herd surged forward, hooves thundering, dust rising like a storm, a wave of fury that swallowed Caleb whole as he bolted, stumbling across the desert, his screams fading into the distance, lost to the wild. Jack holstered his Colt, turning to Lucy, his weathered face softening as he tipped his hat, a faint smile tugging at his lips, a warmth in his eyes that spoke of a man who'd seen pain but still believed in hope. Name's Jack Calder, he said, his voice warm now, like a fire after a long night at a comfort in the fading light. That horse out there, he led me to you. Seems he figured you needed a hand. Lucy stepped forward, her eyes on Shadow, who'd returned to the canyon entrance. His head lowered as if in acknowledgement, his scarred coat gleaming in the last light of day, his eyes deep and knowing. She reached out her hand, brushing his muzzle, and he didn't pull away, his dark eyes meeting hers in a moment of quiet understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of survival. Thank you, Shadow, she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude, with relief, with the weight of a life reclaimed. Night fell of the stars burning bright over the ranch house, a silver blanket across the endless sky, each point of light a promise of something beyond the pain of the past. Lucy sat on the porch, wrapped in a tattered blanket, staring out at the desert, its vastness both beautiful and terrifying, a place that held both death and salvation. Jack leaned against a post, rolling a cigarette with practiced ease, his fingers steady despite the weight of the day, the glow of the match briefly illuminating his face, etching the lines of a man who'd seen too much, but still carried on. You gonna be all right, kid? He asked, his voice quiet, almost lost in the night wind, a question that carried a weight of its own. Sheriff will call this a desert accident. Happens more'n you'd think out here, folks getting lost to the wild, taken by the land, or the creatures that call it home. Lucy nodded, her eyes distant but steady, her hands no longer shaking her heart, finding a rhythm that felt like her own for the first time in years. I ain't afraid no more, she said, her voice soft but sure, carrying a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Shadow showed me what freedom looks like. Jack lit his cigarette, exhaling a thin stream of smoke that curled into the night air, drifting upward like a prayer. That horse ain't like the rest, he said, his voice low, thoughtful. Got a spirit that don't bend, don't break. You got that in you too, Lucy Starr. He mounted smoke, tipping his hat one last time, his silhouette sharp against the starlit sky, a figure carved from the desert itself. If you need me, listen for the hooves, he said, his voice carrying a promise, a vow sealed in the dust and starlight. Shadow'll know where to find me. He rode off into the night, his figure fading into the vast darkness, the sound of Smoke's hooves a faint echo in the distance, a reminder that help could come from unexpected places. Lucy watched her hand resting on the porch rail, the wood rough under her fingers, grounding her in this moment of peace, this fragile new beginning. A faint whinny carried on the wind, Shadow leading his herd across the wild, untamed land, a sound that stirred something deep in her soul, a reminder of the strength she'd found, the freedom she'd claimed. She stood there listening as the sound faded, her heart lighter than it had been in years, her spirit unbroken, forged anew in the crucible of the desert. 2 months later, Lucy stood in the kitchen where her nightmare had begun. The chipped sink still there, the bucket still gray with grit, but the air felt different now, lighter, cleaner, as if the walls themselves had let out a long-held breath, as if the house could finally breathe again. She'd sold Caleb's gear, his saddle, his guns, his whiskey bottles, every trace of his presence to buy supplies enough to keep the ranch going for a while, to keep the chickens fed, the roof patched, the fences mended. She'd taken to fixing things herself, her hands growing stronger with each task, her heart growing lighter with each day that passed without fear. She'd patched the roof with tar and wood-mended fences with wire and sweat-hauled water from the well under the blazing sun, each chore a step toward reclaiming the ranch, toward making it a home again, not a prison. The bruises on her soul were fading, replaced by a quiet strength she hadn't known she had, a fire kindled in the desert's crucible, a resilience that burned brighter with each sunrise. Every evening she walked to the edge of the property where the ranch land met the open desert and stood watching the shadows lengthen across the landscape that had both threatened and saved her, the sagebrush and rocks bathed in the golden light of dusk. The desert was no longer just a place of death and danger. It was a teacher, a witness to her survival, a partner in her rebirth, a vast and honest place that followed its own ancient rules, rules older than human law, stronger than human cruelty. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of fire and gold, movement caught her eye, a line of shapes moving across a far ridge, silhouetted against the orange glow, their forms sharp and graceful against the fading light. Wild horses traveling in single file, their manes flowing like banners, their hooves silent but powerful, a procession of untamed spirits. At their head was a figure whose size and bearing made her heart skip. Shadow, his black coat gleaming in the twilight, his scars a testament to a life of defiance, his eyes deep in knowing, catching the last light of day. He paused on the ridge, turning his head toward the ranch, his gaze seeming to find her across the empty miles, a moment of recognition that needed no words. Lucy raised her hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement, her breath catching as she remembered that terrible afternoon. The thunder of hooves, the scream that changed everything, the moment when a wild horse and a wandering cowboy gave her back her life, gave her back herself. She'd learned something out there among the rocks and wild horses. Something about the difference between surviving and living, about the strength that comes from facing fear and refusing to break, about the power of the wild to set you free. The desert wasn't just a place of death, it was a place of truth where the weak were tested and the strong found their way, where salvation could come from the most unexpected places. She whispered a thank you into the night wind, knowing somehow it would reach him, carried across the miles by the same force that had brought her back, called her to her side by the same wild spirit that had saved her. The herd moved on, vanishing over the ridge, their hoofbeats fading into the vast silence of the desert, a sound that was both a farewell and a promise, a reminder that some things could never be tamed, never be broken. Lucy turned back to the house, her boots crunching on the dry earth, each step surer than the last, her heart steady, her spirit whole. She paused at the porch, looking out one last time, the stars overhead bright and unyielding, a map of possibilities stretching across the sky. The desert looked different now, not an enemy, but a partner, a vast and honest place that had forged her, frightened her, made her whole. She stepped inside, closing the door softly, ready to face whatever came next, knowing she was no longer the scared girl who'd run from Caleb Drake. She was Lucy Starr, forged by the desert, freed by a horse called Shadow, and no one would ever break her again. Word count 5,000 words achieved through expanded sensory descriptions, deeper character reflections, extended dialogue, and detailed action sequences, maintaining the Western tone and narrative structure, with a focus on the rugged beauty of the Arizona desert and the emotional journey of Lucy Starr.